Thank you all for joining us again for the third and final installment today in our Great Lakes Energy Future workshop. For our speakers, what these fine folks have heard about today has been transmission in the grid and all the updates needed to get the energy we're going to produce where it needs to go. And then we transition to the transportation sector and electric vehicles and decarbonization efforts there. But we're excited now to turn our attention to something that gets maybe a little less press, but is no less important, and some would argue even more important, and that is energy efficiency, and especially in our built environment with building codes and new construction and all those things. So we're going to hear a lot about that momentarily. And to tell us about all of that, we have Maddie Lippitt, Sandra Hendry, Marnice Jackson, and Jacob Surfling, or Surfiling. I might have just butchered your last name. I'm sorry about that.
You had it right the first time.
I did it. Okay, great. And they are from assorted organizations, and Maddie will be going first. Maddie is the manager of building codes and policy at Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, or MIA, as you will hear me refer to it from now on. And she's focused there on enhancing building energy efficiency across the Midwest. She champions the advancement of energy codes and building performance standards. Before joining MIA, Maddie built her career as an attorney specializing in environmental and product toxic tort matters, including asbestos and benzene exposure, and practiced civil defense litigation in St. Louis, defending malpractice and discrimination cases. She was recognized in the Super Lawyers Rising Stars list for 2020 and 2021. An active advocate for environmental conservation, Maddie has also been involved with the Missouri Prairie Foundation since 2012. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and biology from Denison University and a Juris Doctor from St. Louis University School of Law, where she was president of the Environmental Law Society and lead editor for the Journal of Health, Law, and Policy. Sandra Hendry is the president and CEO of Slipstream, where she leads the charge in accelerating climate solutions aimed at creating a more equitable and just clean energy future. With a rich background in utilities, nonprofits, and government, she's a proven track record of uniting diverse stakeholders around sustainable energy initiatives. At Elevate, as Senior Director of Energy and Sustainability, she spearheaded clean energy projects. As the first Black woman Chief Sustainability Officer for the city of Chicago, Sandra committed to 100% clean energy by 2035, electrifying the city's bus fleet by 2040, and developing solar energy on city land, contributing to Chicago's win in the Bloomberg Philanthropies American Cities Climate Challenge. Excuse me. Sandra's dedication to energy efficiency is evident in her leadership of Accelerate Performance, promoting performance-based procurement and commercial construction, and organizing a net zero summit for Chicago's private developers. She also serves as secretary on the board of directors for the Institute for Market Transformation, showcasing her commitment and expertise in advancing sustainable practices. Then we're going to hear from two folks from the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, Marnice Jackson and Jacob Surfling. Marnice is a dedicated environmental and climate justice advocate from Pontiac, Michigan. She significantly contributed to community organizing and climate justice through her roles with Mothers Out Front and the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Marnice's educational background includes a BS in interdisciplinary public relations, communications, journalism, and African American studies from Eastern Michigan University, and a master's in social justice from Marygrove College. She actively serves on several boards and coalitions focused on environmental justice, including the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition and the Mission Council on Climate Solutions. And Jacob is an experienced commercial building energy efficiency expert and joined the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition in 2021. He has a BS in mechanical engineering from Iowa State University and a professional engineering license in Iowa. He actively contributes to the green building community, holding a leadership role with the U.S. Green Building Council's Iowa board, and has been involved with the Des Moines, Iowa's Energy Benchmarking Task Force. So, as you can see, we have quite a list of expert sources lined up for you to talk about this. And I believe the plan was to have Maddie go first. And if that is still the case, I can share my screen and stop talking. So hang on for that. I've got your project up. All right, I'm not gonna move everything again so I can actually. Is that showing up?
Yeah.
All right, take it away, Maddie.
Okay, cool. And I know we're tight on time, so I'm going to move through this as fast as possible, but a lot of it's technical, so I'm also going to try and cover the stuff that I think is worth noting. But yeah, like Adam said, I'm Maddie Lippett. I'm the manager of our building codes and policy team at MIA. And I'm mostly going to be focusing on building energy codes today and how they contribute to the grander decarbonization picture. So you can go to the next slide. MIA is a nonprofit membership organization. Very briefly, we're part of a national network, actually, of regional energy efficiency organizations, or RIOs, which actually work through funded partnerships with the U.S. Department of Energy. And so, as our name entails, our vision is really an achievable pathway for all people and communities throughout the Midwest to really receive the economic, environmental, and societal benefits of energy efficiency, and of course, the larger clean energy economy. And you can sort of see the groups of our partners, our members there, and these collaborations with, utilities, third-party program administrators, public officials, advocacy groups, what have you. All of them really help us to expand our reach throughout our region. Next slide, please. All right. And so again, as our name entails, we highly focus on energy efficiency first. And the reason for that is because building energy efficiency is very critical when considering decarbonization. It is especially beneficial for those communities with high energy burdens, since it leads to lower utility bills and things like increased comfort and better indoor air quality. Energy efficiency, I will say, can be a bit of a hard sell when you're comparing it, when you're trying to compare improved insulation in your walls to like sleek new solar panels. That's where we sort of tend to lose people. But efficient buildings actually have twice the impact if you really think about it, because not only they decrease the grid load, but they also decrease the amount of renewables that are needed to achieve net zero energy. So I always like to use this image, which shows annual building energy use, which is in blue, versus the amount of photovoltaic power that's needed to offset those energy needs in yellow. So we have a typical building on the left and a passive building on the right, a passive house building on the right. And as you can see, that super efficient passive building needs a lot less solar PV to offset its building energy use than the baseline building on the left. So showing that efficiency really is critical to decarb, and it gives renewables even more of an impact. Next slide, please. And so what are building energy codes and why are they even important? Building energy codes are really the things that set the minimum standards that dictate energy efficiency of residential and commercial buildings. We always like to say, if it helps put an image in your head, that they serve as the floor of requirements. And as such, they basically designate the worst home that can be built. So, is that floor here or is that floor here? It kind of depends on your code standards. But everyone building in that jurisdiction needs to meet that floor at least. They're developed nationally. Codes are developed nationally by two main organizations, the International Code Council, or the ICC, and they are responsible for developing the International Energy Conservation Code, the IECC, which you will hear me refer to a lot throughout this presentation. And then there's another standard referred to as standard ASHRAE 90.1, which provides additional commercial standards. They both go through very rigorous development processes with input from a very wide range of stakeholders and technical experts, and they are both updated every 3 years. However, the codes are offset in that the ASHRAE 90.1 standard will come out first, and then the IECC will come out after that. So sort of helps because the IECC can refer to ASHRAE's commercial standards when it's developing its own commercial standards. So they sort of work complementary in that way. And I'll just finish this slide by noting that codes in the Midwest are adopted in a number of ways. 9 of MIA's 13 states adopt one mandatory statewide energy code. However, there are others that we refer to as home rule states, and they leave code adoption up to the local municipalities. That being said, all code enforcement is done at that municipal or local level through building code officials, typically. Next slide. So as I mentioned, energy codes lay out the minimum requirements for things like the building envelope, which are things like your insulation, your windows, your air sealing. They also lay out the standards for a lot of mechanical equipment, so like your HVAC systems, and for things like lighting. And as you've heard me refer, the code is broken into residential and commercial provisions. The residential code covers buildings that are 3 stories or less and are used for basic residential purposes. And then the commercial code covers all non-residential buildings and multifamily buildings that are over 3 stories. It's also important to note here that while codes mostly apply to new construction, they can also dictate the efficiency requirements for major renovations and additions to existing buildings. That's usually defined in the code somewhere, what applies as a major renovation or addition. Next slide, please. And I know this slide has a lot of text on it, although it's very important as it covers a lot of why building energy codes are so important. So as I mentioned earlier, codes really help to reduce the energy use of buildings. And it's important to note that they do so for the lifetime of a building. So buildings, as we know, can typically be around for a very long time, sometimes between 50 and 100 years. And it's important because that initial construction, how it's built, those savings can accumulate year after year after year for the lifetime of that building. And just for reference, buildings consume about 40% of the total energy use in the US. So they are very ripe for energy savings through the implementation of codes. Going off of that, the most cost-effective time to implement code measures is during that initial design and construction period, rather than dealing with existing buildings, having to go into people's homes, do some retrofits, bust through the drywall. It's just a lot more cost-effective and efficient to do it, implement those measures at initial construction. With that, with your less energy consumption, building owners and operators will see lower utility bills month after month. And with more efficient appliances, building owners and operators will also see lower maintenance and replacement costs. So codes often reduce the overall cost of ownership. There's a number of health and resilience benefits to building energy codes, including better indoor air quality and less demand on the electrical grid so that it remains reliable for longer periods of time during, say, an emergency or an extreme weather event. Having that very tightly sealed, tightly insulated envelope of your building helps do both of those things. And then I sort of alluded to this earlier, but codes also really benefit building and design professionals by guaranteeing that minimum level of efficiency for all new buildings within a jurisdiction. So they sort of level the playing field as far as any market competition goes. Joe's construction company can't technically build, at a lesser standard than Bill's construction company. And also updating these codes provides an opportunity for builders and contractors to really learn and utilize new construction technologies, new construction practices. So they could be getting a leg up on competition in other neighboring jurisdictions that maybe don't have as strong of code standards. Next slide. This graph just really shows the improvement of those 2 model energy codes I referenced earlier. It's actually statutorily required that the codes get more efficient over time. And I should just point out here that on that y-axis is actually energy use. So a downward movement is a good thing in this graph. As you can see for residential, there are some periods, however, of significant efficiency improvements, as well as some periods of maybe slower improvement, sort of those plateau years there. However, the efficiency improvements are a little more consistent on the commercial side. Next slide, please. This is just a residential codes landscape in the Midwest. Those light gray states are those home rule states I mentioned that do not have statewide codes. And the states and cities with stripes are those that are actually in the process of adopting a new code currently. So as you can see, the codes adopted are pretty mixed in our region, although we did see a pretty big uptake of the 2018 IECC, and actually now especially seeing a pretty good uptake of the 2021. I should also note that many of these states and cities, for example, Ohio and Indiana, they can adopt amendments to those model codes. And those amendments can actually weaken the efficiency standards. So just because a state adopts a model code by name or by reference, the state is still free to add whatever weakening amendments they would like. So while it's the 2018 by name, sometimes the standards are much lower than the model code. Next slide. And this is the landscape for commercial. So as you can see, it's not uncommon for states to adopt residential and commercial codes at different times. Also on the commercial side, I'll just note that we typically see fewer of those weakening amendments that I mentioned than the residential side. So these depictions are a little truer, so to speak, than the ones in that last map. And just some quick updates in the region that have recently happened. Illinois just recently adopted the 2021 IECC for both residential and commercial buildings with just a few amendments. Kansas City, Missouri adopted the full unamended 2021, which I believe makes it the first, or definitely one of the first jurisdictions in our region to do so. And Michigan and Minnesota are also in the process of adopting to that most recent 2021 IECC. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about code development and adoption, but the other key piece when talking about energy codes is compliance. So code compliance, as you all probably know, is very important because passing a code is one thing, but if no one's complying with it, then states and municipalities really aren't getting those energy savings that they think they are. So this is a list of code compliance efforts that MIA itself has done. This isn't necessarily all the efforts taking place throughout the Midwest. And just for the sake of time, I'll touch on these baseline studies. So these are actually studies that set out to measure compliance with the energy code and really try to characterize construction practices happening in a certain area. And basically the point of this is you're really trying to figure out how well builders are meeting code standards in their state and where they might be struggling, where we're not seeing such high rates of compliance. So MIA will actually go into the field, or we'll send a subcontractor into the field and look at specific aspects of buildings that are related to the code. And then based on what we see, we can actually create training sessions to address those areas of non-compliance. These are actually also really important for establishing a compliance baseline. So again, seeing where most people are hitting the mark in case a utility company or someone wants to create some sort of energy efficiency program and claim some savings from that. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on a very recent field study that MIA did in Michigan throughout 2022 and 2023. And basically it concluded that many measures of the residential 2021 IECC are already being practiced by Michigan builders. This is important because as Michigan considers adopting the 2021 IECC, a lot of arguments come up like things, it's too hard, those standards are too hard to meet, they're too difficult to learn and to meet, or the cost of a jump to a higher standard will be too burdensome on home buyers and operators. However, this study was conducted using the United States Department of Energy methodology. And like I mentioned, it found that a lot of the measures of the 2021 IECC were actually already being practiced. So that data really helps to show like, hey, builders, you're actually not as far off as you think. You're actually pretty close. You're already pretty close to those standards that are being talked about for adoption. So, in argument for those reasons, there's really no need, for the state to not adopt the latest code or to weaken the standards of that code. Next slide, please. And the great news is there is a lot of federal funding that's currently available to advance code adoption and implementation and compliance. First, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has the Resilient and Efficient Codes Implementation, or RECI program, RECI funding. Again, supports building code updates, implementation, workforce development and compliance training, and those field studies that I was just talking about. That's important to distinguish versus the Inflation Reduction Act funding. While the bill funding really can go towards any sort of code update or any sort of advancement, the funding through the IRA supports adoption of the latest model energy codes and net zero codes. So those are those 2021 IECC and the ASHRAE 90.1 2019 standard. Or if a jurisdiction wants to make a customized code that results in equivalent or greater energy savings than the latest model energy code, they can feel free to do that as well. The IRA has this formula funding, which basically it just allocated an amount of funding for different jurisdictions based on things like population, demographics, whatever they did, but they basically had some allocated funding, and all the jurisdictions had to do to apply was submit a letter of intent. There will be another application period after that, but just to reserve those funds, they had to submit a letter of intent. And then next slide, please. The IRA, though, also has some competitive funding, which, just like the name entails, isn't quite as simple. You will need to sort of make your case, so to speak, to have that funding allocated to you. But this funding is very similar to the former IRA funding I just mentioned, although it expands the pool of eligible grantees. So now it includes those home rule state localities, and it expanded the qualifying activities. So not necessarily just code standards, but also things like building energy performance standards, or BPSs. So that's really great as well. And then FEMA actually, in a historic announcement, took basically its BRIC program, grant program, which is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, which is historically a pre-disaster hazard mitigation program. And they decided to dedicate a good chunk of funding specifically for code-related projects. So, and it covers a very wide range of things. But again, things pertaining to adoption, implementation, compliance training, workforce development, what have you. But the emphasis is really on resilient, hazard-resistant building codes. Next slide. And this is a big one. This is one of the biggest opposing points that we see to building energy codes, is a growing argument that the building code is not affordable. And I mentioned this a few slides ago, but it's really coming under the guise too of sort of caring about home buyers and owners and occupants. But what I really want to stress here is that, initial construction happens once. A builder touches a building once. And the occupants of that home are in it, for several years. And as we talked about earlier, the benefits of a code really last the lifetime of that building, or the total time of occupation that that family is in there, or that those employees are working in that building. And, I don't want to go through all these benefits again, but the things like the lower utility bills, they can lead to lower healthcare costs with better indoor air quality. Then you have more money to spend on your mortgage or your rent, or, going out and shopping and contributing to the local economy, increased property values, all these things. There's a very large trickle down sort of method that comes from these building energy codes. And so, you know, the difference is that it really comes down to consumer education. A lot of homeowners and occupants, they don't necessarily know to ask about efficiency measures during initial construction. On the other hand, you know, you have builders have a hard time selling something that people can't really see, like insulation in your walls or air and moisture sealing. You know, people are typically more interested in those aesthetic improvements to the home, like granite countertops and things like that. And, you know, builders are very happy to oblige on those sort of improvements. You know, why not? Leads to more money in their pockets. But things like insulation improvements, which are fairly cheap to install at new construction, I mean, they offer very significant utility bill savings for the life of the home. They can really help you avoid some costly repairs and remediations later down the line. Those can't be seen. So builders are, you know, somewhat reluctant to make those investments, even if they do make sense. But, you know, it's worth pointing out, again, the federal funding opportunities that are there that can go not just to government entities, but that those government entities can put out to private parties. They can offer them in the form of incentives or rebates. There are a few IRC incentives that can help builders offset those upfront costs of energy efficiency upgrades. But this is really something that we see come up a lot. So just wanted to flag it. Next slide. And this is just an example. This was actually a very, very timely article that just came out last week. Very, very much worth reading. And it was a very good article. But it'd be great to see, you know, more light shined on this issue and on building energy codes in general. So just wanted to highlight that. Next slide. Sorry about that. And for anyone who wants to learn more about building decarb policies in the Midwest specifically, I and my colleague Allison Lindberg published a paper. It should be on MIA's website, so feel free to check that out. And I think that's my last slide. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, Maddie. So Sandra, you are up next. If you are.
Yes, thanks, Adam.
All right.
I don't have slides.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you, and thanks for your interest in energy efficiency and buildings and decarbonization. I'm Sandra Henry. I am president and CEO of a nonprofit called Slipstream, and our mission is accelerating climate solutions for all. And our jam is buildings, existing and new. And we are really interested in residential, multifamily, single family, and commercial buildings. And so Maddie's discussion about codes is really a foundation for Slipstream's work. We are a collection of engineers, building scientists, researchers, program designers and implementers, educators and trainers, and also financing experts, all centered on how we can build more affordable, efficient buildings. And so what I want to just chat a little bit about today, picking up on Maddie's foundation of codes, is this idea of building decarbonization and electrification. The codes that Maddie talked about really set the stage for creating a building decarbonization playbook. And the idea of the playbook is there are 4 steps, which I'll go through shortly, to get you to building decarb. And the next big problem for us to solve in this industry is to do it at scale. So just setting the table for Chicago specifically, 70% of our emissions, our carbon emissions, come from buildings. And if we make them more efficient, they will burn less fuel for heating and lighting and cooling, which will reduce the emissions that buildings emit. So decarbonization, when you think about how buildings play an important role in that, and emissions is an important, I think, dot to connect. So in my world, the first thing we do when we talk about decarb is to make sure that the building is as efficient as possible, which means you start with the code and you try to improve from there. So things like insulation, making sure that the building is not drafty, it's as comfortable as possible is the first step. making sure that your lighting is efficient is also important. Making sure, because those envelope or the way the building is insulated really has an impact on how big of a heating and cooling system you might need. So it's really important to start with that key building block. And in our, you probably hear people are really excited about solar energy and they want to put solar energy on their homes or their buildings, which is awesome. But if you think about it, is it better to put solar on a more efficient building or one that's poorly performing? Because my question is, if you put it on a poorly performing building, have you really solved the problem of using less energy? So back to efficiency. So once we have a super high efficient building, which is what Slipstream really advocates and works on, the next step is to decarbonize it. And if you're looking at an existing building, you might be looking at the furnace saying, okay, well, it's a boiler and it uses gas. You want to take that out because it's burning fossil fuels for heating and replace it with a heat pump. And the cool thing about heat pumps is not only does it heat your building, it also provides cooling. So in Chicago, I think the statistic is 40% of our single family homes don't have cooling. So if we're putting in heat pumps, now these buildings can, be comfortable in the summer and in the winter. So it's an extra benefit there. The next thing you want to, let's just use a home as an example, because I think that's what Maddie was talking about too. So the next thing you want to think about in your home is, well, how do I heat my water? Probably you use a gas water heater. Well, we have gas heat pumps now not gas heat pumps, but heat pumps that can replace your gas water heater and provide you hot water when you need it. And then let's look at the range. The range might be a gas range. And there are induction options now that use electricity to cook your food. The fun thing about induction is it gives you the control that some of us like when we use a gas range. So those are some of the technologies that we are promoting and asking our contractors to install when we start looking at decarbonization for multifamily and single family homes. So once you've made your home as efficient as possible and you've taken out all the fossil fuel burning equipment and replaced it with electric, the next step ideally would be to connect to renewable energy. That's the fourth step in my playbook, or the playbook that I like to talk about. And once you do that, that's great. And so now ideally you're generating most of your electricity needs from solar and your home is electric, but you might be connected to your utility because, it depends on what state you're on, but there is an interconnection process. And there is quite a bit of conversation across the country about, well, if we electrify all these buildings, can our grid actually handle it? And there are technologies, and this is something that actually Slipstream is working on now. It's a pilot. There are technologies that allow control over the buildings and the load of the building and when that interfaces with the electric grid. So the goal with the controls is really to make sure that we're not overloading our distribution or transmission system. And there's a pilot that Slipstream is running right now under DOE's Connected Communities funding opportunity. It's with the city of Madison, Wisconsin, and Madison Gas and Electric, where we actually have buildings where we're testing these controls to see how they interface and operate between the utility and the building. The other thing I wanted to just share that we're excited about is there's this, as Maddie mentioned, there's this amazing opportunity for funding coming from the federal government through Bill, RECI, IRA, and Slipstream and other organizations are taking advantage of that funding. There was a buildings upgrade prize or buildings up prize, I think that was issued by EPA, and Slipstream was fortunate enough to win 2 of those prizes. One is happening in Milwaukee, where we are the lead. It's called the Cream Cities Challenge, and I'll put a link to the press release in the chat when I'm finished. But the exciting thing about this is it really gives us an opportunity to work with community in decarbonizing a couple of communities in the city of Milwaukee. And our kind of our anchor will be working with houses of worship to decarbonize the houses of worship, and then also to educate community on how that can happen elsewhere in their communities. So I'm excited about that. We also won a similar prize for a couple of nonprofits in Boston as well. So what excites me about Substream is I truly feel like we have the research and the knowledge to help advance building decarb faster and more cost effectively. And now we actually get to practice that and test it out in these wonderful communities that have invited us to help them. So I will stop there and hand it back to Adam.
All right, thanks so much, Sandra. And now I think we have Jacob queued up, and if I'm not mistaken, Marnice got pulled away.
Yeah, she did, and I apologize. That is definitely everybody else's loss. But we'll muddle through with just me here, and that'll be fine. Let me share my screen up here. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm the Director of Policy and Projects with the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. Our overall mission as an organization is to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. And we work across 8 states in the Midwest that are our priority states. We were actually launched in late 2019 as a project of a state-based organization, Fresh Energy in Minnesota, who is a leader on clean energy issues in that state. But they saw a lot of shared challenges across the region with addressing those building emissions that Maddie and Sandra both touched on before, and some value in being able to collaborate across the region and talk about how other folks were tackling that. So that's kind of the origin story. We've since moved on to become our own independent group. And we really have a pretty wide-ranging mix of members, including Slipstream and Mia, who participate in our spaces, and larger national green organizations, but also down to local level environmental justice or church green teams or community development corporations that are starting to understand how this idea of building decarbonization intersects with other things that they're working on or care about. So we really try to facilitate that education up of our members as well, so that they can be effective advocates for this in their communities. You can see Marnice and some of our members there. So like I said, our staff is myself and Marnice as executive director, and a number of other folks across the Midwest. And in general, in terms of how we support our members, we have a number of different policy-focused working groups to work collaboratively with folks on these items. We dedicate a large percentage of our funding to re-grants out to grassroots level members to do projects in their own communities, and then a number of events and trainings throughout the year, some of which I may reference as we go here. So you can find us at midwestdecarb.org and all the various social media channels. So that's just a little bit of background on us as an organization. I wanted to touch a little bit on how we're helping folks connect with building decarb that are maybe new to that topic a little bit, and touch on some of the advocacy things that we have, hopefully not doubling up too much on territory that Maddie and Sandra already covered. But like I said, we tend to be bringing a lot of new folks to this concept. So found it easier to think of building decarb as sort of the new 3 R's, right? A lot of us grew up with reduce, reuse, recycle. So in terms of talking about building decarbonization, reduce, replace, and renewable. So reduce is that energy efficiency piece that Maddie and Sandra were talking about. limiting that overall amount of energy that homes and buildings need in the first place to be, a functional place to live and work, to keep it fairly comfortable for the residents. Replace is kind of what we would call electrification, right? Replacing all of those appliances that directly use fossil fuels at the building site with something that can run on electricity. So this is where we're talking about things like induction stoves and heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and things like that in folks' buildings. And then that last R, renewables, making sure that the electricity that's being supplied to those appliances is coming from some sort of carbon-free source, whether that be rooftop solar or something else that's at the building site itself, or making sure that any purchased electricity from the utility is coming from some sort of clean carbon-free source. And we really emphasize to folks that these are, three things that need to be done in conjunction with each other if we're going to reach that goal of eliminating building emissions in the Midwest on the timeline that we know we need to. And I just wanted to touch briefly on why this is specifically a challenge in the Midwest, and a lot of that is because we're very heating dominant. As all of us experiencing today's weather are familiar with. In the survey that the Department of Energy does every 4 years of how buildings in the country are consuming energy, the estimate for the Midwest region was that 72% of residential energy consumption came from space and water heating. And that's super critical to understand that that's where the bulk of building or home energy usage is coming from in the Midwest, because by and large, those are things that are being served directly by fossil fuels in the home, right? The main fuel source for heating in close to 80% of homes in the Midwest is some form of combustion, mostly natural gas, but also a fair amount of propane or wood burning as well. Only about a fifth of the housing stock in the region is already electrified. And then also core to our mission, and I think as I delve into some of the advocacy things that we have taken on as a coalition, is this idea of equitable building decarbonization. Have their definition that our equity working group came up with here on the screen here. And I won't read the whole thing, but I think the theme of it really is not just looking at how we are eliminating emissions and having that as the end goal, but also understanding that folks are going to need different levels of assistance to get there, that there are legitimate and fair questions about who's going to benefit economically from all of the activity that's created from this transition, or who has a seat at the table for making those decisions about how we're going to get there and what those timelines look like. So we definitely try to center that in our approach to talking about these different issues as a coalition. So I wanted to touch on two different of our working groups and kind of their current focuses in terms of policy things. Obviously, buildings, we spend up to 90% of our time indoors. They intersect with so many aspects of our life. So these are not an exhaustive list of things that we care about as a coalition or working on, but I think they give a good flavor of the issue and what advocates are up against. So we have a federal policy working group that's co-led by myself and James Trice from Minnesota's Public Policy Project, and Deirdre Nieves, who with Western Michigan Environmental Action Council and is also a professor at Western Michigan University. And that group for the past year and a half has really been focused on what's happening with state implementation of federal dollars through the Inflation Reduction Act and to a lesser extent the bipartisan infrastructure law, which we've talked about before. This massive federal investment, and a lot of it does pertain to building decarbonization. But even though it's federal money, a lot of that money is going to end up flowing through new states who are going to have a heavy hand in implementing those things. So helping our members understand how that money is going to flow and how they can best help their communities benefit from that. So I wanted to touch on something that we bring up with our members quite a bit. And there's a lot of celebration, and rightfully so, of the level of federal investment in climate work that we've seen through the Inflation Reduction Act. Certainly unprecedented level of federal investment in taking climate action. But looking at the funding that pertains to building decarbonization, wanting folks to understand that the vast majority of that money is coming in the form of tax credits, right? Things that you can claim on your end of the year income taxes for doing home energy efficiency improvements or installing solar and things like that. And that's the vast majority of that federal investment in building decarbonization is coming in that form. A much smaller piece are direct grants or rebates to folks to do those things. And this is really important to understand when you're thinking about the equity ramifications of this energy transition, because a lot of those most underserved or at-risk communities maybe don't have enough tax liability to take advantage of those tax credits, or are simply unable to eat the upfront cost and wait for that tax rebate to come. So when we're talking about the level of direct assistance through the Inflation Reduction Act compared to how much of that investment is coming in the form of tax credits, I think there's certainly quite a bit of room for improvement there. And that $9 billion that I referenced there on that graph has to do with 2 home energy rebate programs that our members are super interested in through the Department of Energy that were created as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Overall, it's called the Home Energy Rebates Program, but it actually encompasses 2 separate rebate programs that each are about half of that $8.8 billion of funding. So the first is HERA, or the Home Electrification and Appliance Rebates. These are point of sale rebates for specific electric appliances, such as heat pumps or heat pumps, water heaters, or select electrification projects, such as panel upgrades and things like that. So those are rebates that are really aimed at this idea of transitioning folks to electrified appliances. And I should say that these will both be programs that are income qualified for low to moderate income households. The second rebate program is the home or home efficiency rebates. These are more, I guess, holistic would be the way to think about it in terms of rebates for energy efficiency. Basically, you would get rebated based on demonstrating that some combination of projects done to the home resulted in at least 20% energy savings annually, either through some sort of measuring of that energy usage or modeling it out to project what the savings would be with that. So this will be for projects that are in terms of, maybe you're doing some insulation upgrades and a window replacement and replacing an outdated appliance, and that all adds up to that level of savings there.
Your mic cut out.
Did my mic cut out? How early did my mic cut out?
It worked for me for the most part. It's been a little glitchy.
Yeah,
Okay.
I heard it.
Yeah.
Okay. My
Your battery might have died.
apologies. I'll try to speak up and hopefully that'll pick up better. The other key thing to understand with those rebate programs is, again, this is money that has been formula allocated to all 50 states. So it's federal money that's financing these rebates, but all states will run their own programs through their state energy offices, and within some guidelines that by DOE will have some flexibility in how they're going to administer and run their own programs. So this kind of comes around to how our coalition has been engaging with this, which is while those funds have been allocated, the states do still need to submit an application to DOE to receive them, and they have until the end of January 2025 to get those plans in. So they're actively working on putting together those applications and their implementation plans right now. As part of that process, they're required to hold public input sessions. The only state that has done that so far that we work in is Wisconsin, largely because they already had the infrastructure of a statewide energy efficiency program, the Focus on Energy program, which manages their utility finance energy efficiency rebates. So they were able to move a little bit quicker than some of the other states that we have seen. But they're required to hold these public input sessions and demonstrate how they're using that to input their program design. So this is an aspect in which we're working with our members to make sure that they're aware of when those sessions are happening, understand what to expect in those venues, and able to advocate for things that we want to see in those programs in terms of protections for tenants in cases where the rebates are being used in rental properties, or making sure that efficiency rebates are not being used to subsidize gas appliances in some cases where the guidelines are vague enough that it might allow that. So that's one thing. And then another aspect of our work that I wanted to touch on is our affordable housing working group, which again, I co-lead with Madeline McCullough from the National Housing Trust, working to integrate building decarbonization into affordable housing programs. A lot of our focus has been on the federal low-income housing tax credit program, which really drives a lot of that affordable housing development in many states. So just a little bit of background on that. The LHTC, or low-income housing tax credits, were created in the 80s to encourage the development of more affordable housing projects by offsetting some of that cost through those tax credits. This is another case where the tax credits are federal, but states largely run their own programs in a few larger cities such as New York, Chicago, and DC. They create their own application process and grading criteria to determine which projects in any given annual cycle are going to receive those tax credits. And that scoring rubric is called their Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP. So those plans encompass a lot of different elements in terms of number of units that are held at a certain affordable level of rent, amenities on the site of the building, distance to different services or things like that, to try to demonstrate which projects are going to be the most beneficial and attractive for low-income renters. But one of the things that they can include that we've been working as a coalition to encourage is higher levels of energy efficiency or even electrification and decarbonization. And we've been trying to make the case that, is it truly an affordable housing unit if the utility bills are sky high, even if the rent is low? So we've been working with states to try to get them to bake higher levels of requirements for energy efficiency into that program, encourage things like electrification or at least electric readiness for the building into there, or incentivize them for including things like on-site renewables. In most cases, there's maybe some token points given towards some of those things, but the feedback that we often hear from the developer community is that it's not rewarded at a high enough level to really move the needle for them. So we're trying to get those state housing authorities to put a little bit more beef behind those things. But I'll stop there. I will just mention that a lot of this is pulled from other sessions that we've held to educate our members. So definitely if you go to midwestdecarb.org and past trainings, you can find our Building Decarb 101 and 102 and other educational sessions that we've had. Certainly any of these we could talk about for a much longer length of time. But I'll stop there because I know we want to leave time for questions from folks.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Appreciate it. And thanks, Sandra and Maddie as well. So now we've reached Q&A. The journalists know how to let me know they have a question, and they've already been doing that. So Michael, you're first out of the gate.
Thanks for this. Thanks, Adam. Really appreciate your time, everyone. I'm just curious how all of these, very well-intentioned and smart economical projects square with cities like Chicago or utilities like People's Gas, charging ratepayers an astronomical sum to replace gas pipelines and essentially potentially locking communities into a gas-dependent future rather than the kind of future that you folks envision.
Um,
Did you stump them?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah,
I'll
whoever, yeah, go for
Um,
it, and we'll let you all.
Yeah,
talk.
and please, Jacob and Maddie, chime in. It is just it's concerning. As a citizen of the city, it is concerning. I can't, I'm not gonna speak for the city. I'll just say as a citizen, it is concerning. Because, the mechanics is it locks our customers of the gas company into supporting this expenditure. So it is definitely concerning, and it is the exact opposite of what I as a citizen would want to see us doing. I think there's the Clean Affordable Buildings Act has been introduced to city council, and I haven't been tracking it lately, but I think that is a really good first step for Chicago. And if for folks that don't know, this would require that any new construction would not have natural gas service. And I'm sure it's got some kind of building size limitation on it. And I think that's a great first step for the city's advancement toward 100% clean energy. So as a citizen of Chicago, I support that, and I will, speak with my aldermen and do whatever I can to educate the alders on why this is important. I am aware of the marketing campaign that is happening right now around natural gas service being unsafe, and it's an interesting story. I'm trying not to express my very strong personal opinions and stay professional, but that is a very interesting story that they're threading there. And I'll leave it at that and see if anyone else has something else to share.
I'll just chime in on that, not only the expansion of the gas infrastructure, but on the building side, something that I try to relay to our members and by extension, then lawmakers and decision makers is just understanding just how long some of this stuff lasts when you install it, right? American Institute of Architects estimates that 80% of the buildings that we're going to have in 2050 are already here or are currently under construction. I think the last I looked, the average, median life of a gas boiler or a gas furnace is around 25 years. So we are running up to that point of anytime you just throw in a gas furnace again in an emergency replacement situation, or God forbid, design a new house around it, we're now at that point where realistically you're leaving somebody with an unnecessary cost to replace that before the end of its natural life if we're serious about zero emissions by 2050, right? So that's a real concern. And the other piece, this is a whole other topic that we could get into, but something that we actually collaborate with Slipstream on is this clean heat infrastructure initiative, kind of advancing this alternative vision for municipalities or gas utilities that what do customers actually care about getting delivered from their gas utilities? Are they in love with having methane pumped into their house? No, they want to have heat delivered to their house, right? And there are other forms of that we can look at transitioning those gas utilities to. So, one concept is this idea of, thermal energy networks that would be, community scale geothermal systems that folks could connect into instead. And that's the pipe that runs into your house instead of natural gas. So I think there are alternative visions out there. I think utilities are, big, slow moving entities that it's hard to move in that direction, but certainly, in other parts of the country, we've seen gas utilities in Massachusetts pilot transitioning to those types of systems. In Minnesota, through their Natural Gas Innovation Act, we've seen their gas utilities required to start piloting some of these things. So we're hoping, that that's a vision that becomes more realistic rather than continuing to expand on gas only.
All right, thanks, Jacob.
Adam, can I just follow up real quick? I'm kind of adding on to that. It's like all these clean energy bills in states. It doesn't seem like any of them have a carrot stick approach to this question, right? For example, Illinois, the CEJA legislation that's been talked about also included a pretty sizable ratepayer subsidy to keep nuclear plants running. And you can make arguments about, is that a good thing for the climate, whatnot. But nothing included in that was, hey, the owner of those nuclear plants or its customer facing utility, in this case ComEd, would have to do more to electrify homes. Am I missing something there?
Yeah, I mean, Maddie, you'd maybe be the one to answer some of that. Like in a lot of cases, the laws that were passed, more 30 or so years ago that kind of created a lot of the energy efficiency programs that utilities run were written in a way that doesn't allow for what we'd call fuel switching. They literally, even if they wanted to, are not allowed to run a program that gives you an incentive to take out a gas appliance and replace it with an electric one. And there are reasons why that made sense 30 years ago, but certainly now it kind of, I say to folks, it leaves us in a situation where we have a hammer and what we really need is a screwdriver at this point, but we're trying our best to make the hammer work for what we need to do. I'll just kind of leave it at that, I guess.
Maddie, did you want to add anything to that?
Not in particular. I was going to say too, I wasn't really even in this industry yet by the time CEJA was being drafted and passed, but just from what I've seen so far, I would agree it's sort of this very delicate balance of a phase out, sort of this, I don't want to say non-committal, but not everything's going to be electric tomorrow type mentality. And I'm also seeing a lot of, in that same vein, I'm seeing a lot of like the EPCA preemption issue come up. I don't know who's all familiar with that, but that could open a whole other can of worms at this point. But it's along those same lines where, the codes that are adopted need to be flexible, basically. And while you can incentivize people to electrify, you know, it's still sort of, you run this risk of being penalized for banning outright any gas, natural gas, or, you know, burning appliances in your home. There needs to still be that option, is what we're seeing a lot of. There needs to be that option. It can be disincentivized. It can't, you know, turn around and be penalized. But that's sort of a big issue that's coming up right now as people are starting to look at all electric new construction codes and all electric new construction ordinances. So not much more to add other than we're just sort of advising our jurisdictions. You know, there's those 7 criteria within the federal EPCA law. And it's basically like offer a lot of different alternative compliance pathways for folks. And you can't just, you know, require all electric, basically, is it really as much as I can say.
All right, thanks. Carol Thompson had a question.
Hi, thank you, everyone. This is a question for anybody. I'd like to hear more about connecting this effort to decarbonize homes and buildings with rental housing. And are there any like examples, I guess, out there of successfully, I'm just thinking that the incentive structure is a little off. Like it's hard to think of what it might take to get a landlord to fill out the paperwork to get the new windows when they're not paying the utility bills anyway. So I'd like to hear about that. And also, are there any stories of like success that you could point to?
I'm gonna put the link in the chat. Elevate, which is a nonprofit based in Chicago. They also work in Michigan, Wisconsin, and other states. When I was working there, they received funding to do a pilot of 10 single family homes for decarbonization, but then found additional funding to look at decarbonizing multifamily as a pilot. This is multifamily rental units. And I'll see if I can find information or a case study that talks about their approach to getting the building owners buy-in, but then also the residents, and explaining the benefits of the effort. I'm pretty sure I moved on to Slipstream before the pilot was concluded, but I'll see if I can find that information for you. I think the takeaway that I would share is it required a lot of communication, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of negotiating between the residents and the building owner to like really outline the benefits of electrification. So I'm happy to share that, and happy to also connect you, Carol, with folks at Elevate that could probably give you a better story than what I have today.
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
And sort of as a follow-up, I don't know if anyone was going to jump in. Am I wrong? Like, is that a challenge, working with rental housing?
You have no idea.
Okay.
Yeah. I was gonna say though, I have one example of a policy that's a bit of a silver lining that I always like to refer to, and that's Minneapolis's 4D Affordable Housing Incentive Program. And I'll look for a link as well to throw in the chat, but basically the gist is that it offers rental property owners a tax incentive or a bit of a tax break for making energy efficiency or other green improvements to the building. And then in return, those property owners have to agree to keep something like 20% of their units at the affordable. And affordable is defined as households making less than 60% of the area median income. So that is a program that's been around for a while. And then, yeah, it's sort of that tit for tat, you know, we'll give you a break for doing this and this. And then Ann Arbor is also, I believe, working on a green rental housing ordinance I think it's still in the development process. However, last time I went to the website, there had already been some, you know, really good outreach that had been done. And there's a really good list of like FAQs or like a lot like considerations that were currently brought up. And I think some attempts at answers. And while that sounds sort of, you know, non-committal, it actually shed a lot of light on just some possible solutions and other things that were being brought up by folks. But yeah, they're working on one as well, but I'll try and find that Minneapolis program too.
I was just going to add one last thing with regards to those homes and hero rebates that I didn't mention is that I think states are going to have to start trying to figure this out in a way that they haven't before. I think in the past, I think other low-income assistance programs like weatherization assistance or LIHEAP are so underfunded that they're, you know, we can't serve all the single family owned homes that we would like to. So we're not even gonna really start worrying about multifamily yet. But with these new rebates, the Homes and Hero ones, DOE has said that they have to have at least a minimum 10% set aside for low income multifamily with those rebates. So DOE is, you know, telling states that they need to start taking that seriously. And so I think we're going to see a lot more movement of them figuring out what that outreach looks like. And there are definitely questions with that, you know, in terms of, you know, equity or risk to renters of what happens when your landlord makes improvements to the property with those rebates. DOE is telling states that they have to have a minimum of 2 years of protections from things like, you know, evictions or rate increases, but a lot of questions about like what enforcement of that actually looks like or what recourse renters are going to have to prove that that's actually why their rent went up and things like that. So stay tuned, I guess, with that, but I know that that is a question that, you know, states just haven't had capacity to take on before, and now they're kind of going to be forced to start reckoning with it a little bit more.
All right. Well, that was a meaty question, Carol. Well done. Alexa, you are up next.
Hi there. I think this is mostly for Maddie, and it's probably pretty in the weeds, so apologies, this isn't my area of expertise. But when you were talking about codes, it got me thinking. I've talked to like people who are in cities that have their own codes in addition to the national kind of standard codes, in order for folks to get like a certificate of occupancy to sell their homes. So like to what extent would more energy efficient codes that you're talking about like trickle down to those folks and potentially impact how they're able to sell their house? Because like I know for some of these small municipalities, you know, you buy your house 30 years later, all of a sudden they added all these things and you can't get that certificate of occupancy, and then it's like you're stuck making all these updates or losing a ton on your home. So maybe that's a little unrelated, but hoping you could clarify if it's just like a new build thing you're talking about, or if these are applying to homes of a certain age.
Yeah, so they are mostly all new construction, except for, like I said, if you have one of those major renovations or additions. And again, that's sort of defined in the jurisdiction's code. Usually it's like a major addition or renovation will be X amount of square feet or like 25% of the size of the building type thing. But again, it's kind of up to the jurisdiction to decide that. But codes, we're usually talking about new construction. And for any other type of building decarb policy, I feel like there are usually exemptions for anyone who can show that they haven't had that like certificate of occupancy in place. So I know this is a big thing coming up with COVID, right? It's like a lot of people weren't going downtown to work in their buildings, and there just like weren't, you know, the people in there. But yeah, I'm pretty sure, and Sandra or Jacob, correct me if that's wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's built in as an exception to most codes or other building decarb policies. So you're not on the hook for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I know just from like direct experience with Des Moines when they were passing their energy benchmarking ordinance, which now requires commercial and multifamily buildings over, I want to say 50,000 square feet, but I don't have it right in front of me. But larger buildings within the city to annually report their energy usage. That had exceptions baked into it that were kind of worked out during stakeholder sessions in terms of, like you said, occupancy or some other barrier to being able to get that data. And I think that's pretty typical and something that, you know, cities are mindful of when they're passing these types of things.
All right, thanks, Jacob. Sherry has a question.
Hi, thanks everyone. This has been a really fascinating panel. Thank you so much. I have kind of a two-part question. One, I've done some reporting in the past where a bunch of really smart people seem to think that the Great Lakes region, like all the states and provinces around the Great Lakes, are really can be expected to be a climate haven in the coming decades and centuries. That a greater percentage of the North American population can be expected to live around the Great Lakes 100 and 150 years from now. So given that, you know, like looking through that lens, you know, is it more urgent in this area, in this Great Lakes area, that we address this more rapidly, particularly in the realm of affordable housing, workforce housing? And then, secondly, to what to what degree do we have a responsibility to consider limiting square footage in residential construction? To give you some context, I live in Traverse City. We've got a whole lot of McMansions up here, and it's really obnoxious. So I'm wondering if there's any effort in this building decarbonization realm to look at that issue, the moral imperative of limiting square footage for residential construction.
I love the idea. I don't know if I've seen it come up, although it might be something too that would be more like in the zoning code. I don't know. But I love the idea. And as to your question earlier about, can you repeat that first question? The one regarding the Great Lakes?
It's a lot of people think that the Great Lakes are going to be a climate haven, you know, that like a lot of people are going to move here, that like people who are building homes in Phoenix, they're building homes that nobody's going to live in 100 years because nobody's going to want to live there in 100 years. They're all going to want to live here. So, you know, do we have a greater responsibility here in the Great Lakes to you know, update our building codes, to decarbonize our buildings? You know, is it more important than we do it here than others elsewhere?
So I will say this, I'm not sure of the reasoning behind this, although a big theory behind why MIA put together that you know, Midwest Building Decarb Policies paper was really so that other Midwest jurisdictions could see what other Midwest jurisdictions were doing. And I only preface that by saying, you know, the Midwest does have its eyes on places and states like Illinois, Chicago, Minnesota, who just have been, you know, moving in that direction. They've just been, for whatever reason that is, been more progressive. And it's been helpful, at least that we've seen, when you go and you're talking to a smaller city in the Midwest, that you're pointing to other Midwestern states or cities who are doing these, passing these codes, passing these types of policies, because what we get a lot is like, well, we're not California and we're never going to be California. And, you know, we're not New York and we're not going to be. So it helps in that sense. you know, for jurisdictions in the Midwest to be leaders. And if that, I don't know if what the reasoning would be to sort of incentivize them to move that way, but it's helpful for us to see and point to jurisdictions that, you know, what's being done in their own backyard has sort of, you know, really worked as a catalyst to get some other smaller cities and municipalities like passing these types of things, or at least starting to talk about them. So that's really, I guess, what I have to say about that. But I'll hand it over to Sandra or Jacob too.
Go ahead, Jamie.
But well, I was just that so 2175, that's 150 years from now is about 2175. And probably yes, you know, 150 years from now, I'm sure that the demographics of our country will look very different for many reasons. There are folks that are relocating because of climate now. I don't know exactly what the figures are, but I think it's already happening. But I think there's another reason why we should have a sense of urgency, and that is because at least in Chicago, our threats will be flooding and heat, and we've already seen that. We had wild flooding last summer. Many communities were flooded out and are still trying to recover from that. Many of those communities were low and moderate income and less able to recover from that big shock. So having the conversation about making our buildings resilient because it will help our citizens recover more quickly is an important conversation. The other one is related to heat. And I'm sure that we all remember the elderly ladies that died in their homes to the north of, I'm downtown to the north of me, because of heat at the wrong time of the year. So heat and flooding are really important. And I think the conversation I would like to have around urgency is to make sure that all citizens of Chicago can live comfortably during, you know, heat events and cold events, and also have less fear of being flooded out of their homes. And those are things that construction codes and practices, building codes and practices can help address.
Yeah, I think like the other thing I'd add on to that question is just, I think building decarb is super critical for the Midwest. If for no other reason than, you know, compared to any other, like if you look at the big census regions of the country, only New England has a longer or more intense heating season than we do. I put up that you know, that graph showing that, you know, 72% of our or the majority of residential energy usage in the Midwest comes from heating. That's much higher than other parts of the country, and that 80% being on, you know, fossil fuels for that main heating fuel. That percentage is also higher than the rest of the country. Higher percentage of gas water heaters than the rest of the country, right? So this idea of you know, that specific piece of it of transitioning to electric, or the amount of fossil fuel combustion that's happening right in your home or where you work is, you know, much higher in this part of the country than other places.
All right, thanks. We have time for a couple more questions here. I'm going to let Lisa ask first, and then Carol can finish.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm curious, as experts, what is a hole that you see in reporting on building resiliency that you wish you would see more reporting on? I'm thinking in particular about this transition to heat pumps. I know that it seems like there seems to be a general conception still that they can't properly heat homes in colder climates. So there's obviously like that is like a big thing that we have to get through in terms of reporting on this. But I'm just curious if you have any more insights onto this in terms of what you could help us with as reporters.
It's been tested, it works. I'll put some links in the chat related to Slipstream's research around cold climate heat pumps. So I think that would be helpful, is to echo and amplify the research. Not only Slipstream, but other organizations also have data that supports and demonstrates that the technology works in cold climates. I think that's really important. And then I think the other piece that's important to share is that heat pumps heat and cool. So if there are homes that don't have cooling, heat pumps can offer that as a benefit.
Yeah. And this just popped into my head, so disagree with me if this is wrong, but also just continuing to see the reference to heat pumps as a new technology, even though they've been around for quite some time, I would just say is maybe another change that could be emphasized. And then also, I mentioned this earlier, but really just this concept of affordability and what that means for, you know, the total occupation of people's lives in these homes. I mean, it can't be emphasized enough that we spend so much time in buildings, and, you know, it keeps coming back to these initial upfront costs of these improvements. And again, I'm speaking to codes specifically, but you know, those savings you start to see in a matter of months. And also when you think of the fact that those initial upfront costs are minimal, somewhat minimal to begin with, but then even more so when you think about them across, you know, like a 30-year mortgage or something. But just what all those additional savings mean for folks, about more money in your pocket and less money spent on healthcare and less money spent on utility bills and things like that. I just think is just such an important piece that people often forget. And so it is about this balance between energy efficiency, of course, and affordability concerns, especially for low-income homeowners who are particularly susceptible to those utility costs. But I just think those are stories that should be highlighted more.
Yeah. I think one thing that we didn't touch on as a challenge is definitely workforce to take this on. HVAC, electrician, plumbing, name it, but especially on the HVAC installers end, the median age for folks in that field has been consistently trickling up. It's rapidly graying. And so I think, you know, a lot of folks maybe take it as a signal that they shouldn't be confident in the technology when they don't have contractors, you know, coming out and recommending and promoting it to them. But I think so much of that has to do more with those installers being so overwhelmed with their normal bread and butter work already, let alone trying to like take on educating their workforce on a new technology, or you know, getting into a situation where they're, you know, trying to market that to a customer that might still be skeptical about it. They just don't see it as their role to sell customers on that, and don't, I think, maybe have the capacity to take that on. I will shout out the Minnesota Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative, which is doing great work with contractors to try to work on that. But that is definitely a challenge as well, just simply having enough folks to install these things in the first place.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Carol, your final quick question.
I promise to be quick. It's along the lines of the last question. What is the one biggest challenge standing in the way of decarbonizing buildings?
More people.
Workforce. Yeah.
Not
Honestly.
many people, yeah.
I'm gonna put a resource. It's called E2. I think they're a nonprofit, but they kind of track clean energy jobs in the Midwest. It's a huge gap. We need more workers. And I think we also need to communicate very clearly to our students in high school that you know, this is an alternative to a 4-year college degree that could pay you you could have a career, a very successful one. Because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Not only heat pump installers, we need plumbers, electricians, weatherization experts, building science experts. And many of those jobs do not require a 4-year degree. They do require some experience in education. So I think that is a huge, huge need around communication in terms of what this workforce looks like and the opportunities that are there.
You will be happy to know that that is one of the sessions slated for our third installment of this workshop on March 13th. So we're going to dig into the workforce development side of this.
Oh, can
So
I come?
that's you
Can I come
sure?
listen?
Absolutely. I will let you know when and where.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much for spending a part of your afternoon with us. We truly appreciate your time. As I warn all of our speakers, you haven't heard the last of us. They're going to get your contact information. And before you go, we have to give you a round of applause. So here is us clapping golf claps
Thank
in your Zoom
you.
screens. We very much appreciate this.